Lyra met Kane under a weak streetlight that flickered like it was tired of trying. Rain slid down her coat, soaking into fabric she had forgotten to care about. She had been walking without direction, letting the night decide where she would end up. When Kane stepped into the light. If you've ever loved, lost, or felt broken by someone you cared about, this channel is for you. Subscribe, like, and stay with us for more real stories that speak from the heart. She noticed his smile first. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't warm. It was precise, as if he had been waiting for her exact moment of breaking. You look like someone who's been holding too much inside, he said. She laughed quietly, startled. Do I? He nodded slowly. Yes, I can see it. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Not gently. Not with certainty. It felt like someone had finally read a language she never knew how to speak aloud. They stood there longer than necessary, rain blurring the world around them, until Lyra realized she was no longer cold. She felt chosen. When he offered to walk her home, she hesitated for a second too long. I won't hurt you, Kane said calmly, like it was a fact, not a promise. She believed him. That belief settled into her chest like relief. That night, as they walked side by side, he asked questions that felt intimate but safe. Where she came from. What scared her. What she wished someone had protected her from. Lyra answered everything. She didn't know yet that this was how he learned where to press. Their connection deepened fast, like something collapsing inward. Kane listened to Lyra the way starving people look at food. He leaned forward when she spoke, never interrupting, never missing a detail. You think too deeply, he told her one night as they sat on her couch. Is that bad? She asked. For most people, yes. But for you, he smiled. It makes you special. She should have noticed how often he defined her, how easily his words wrapped around her identity. But she was tired of feeling invisible. When Kane called her sensitive, he said it like praise. When he said she felt things too much, he made it sound rare, almost sacred. People like you get hurt easily, he added once, brushing her hand. So you need someone who understands how delicate you are. The word delicate stayed with her. She began repeating it to herself. Kane texted constantly. If she didn't reply quickly, he noticed. Everything okay? Yes, she typed back. Just checking. I worry about you. No one had worried about her like that before. The attention felt like love. She didn't realize it was also surveillance. Slowly, she started shaping her words, her reactions, even her silences to fit what she thought he needed. She thought this was intimacy. She didn't know she was being trained. Nights became their world. Kane's apartment felt like a separate universe, cut off from consequence. He held Lyra close on the balcony, city lights trembling below them. You're strong, he whispered, but you don't know it yet. She leaned into his chest. You make me feel safe. He paused just long enough to let the words settle. Good. That pause mattered. She didn't see it then. Kane spoke often about fate, about broken people finding each other for a reason. Do you know why this works? He asked once. Why? Because you trust me. She nodded. Trust felt easy with him. Natural. She told him things she had never said out loud. Old wounds. Old fears. Every insecurity. Kane absorbed it all, storing it carefully. When she cried, he held her. When she doubted herself, he reassured her. Just enough. You don't need anyone else, he said casually one night. She smiled, thinking it was romance. I mean it, he added. Lyra stopped calling friends without consciously deciding to. Canceling plans felt reasonable. Kane needed her. She wanted to be needed. The more she gave, the closer he seemed. She didn't notice how rarely he asked what she wanted. Love felt like surrender, and she mistook that for devotion. The first crack came quietly. Kane asked about her friends one evening while scrolling through his phone. Do they actually care about you, he asked. Or are they just used to you being around? Lyra laughed, unsure. Why would you ask that? I'm just observant, he replied. After that, his questions sharpened. Why did she need to see them so often? Why did she trust people who didn't truly understand her? They don't protect you like I do, he said. Protect. The word sounded good. Heavy. Important. Lyra began second-guessing her relationships. Kane never told her to leave them outright. He didn't have to. His silence did the work. His raised eyebrow. His disappointment. One night, she told a story she found funny. Kane didn't laugh. What? She asked. Nothing, he said. It's just, not very you. She flushed. What do you mean? I thought you were deeper than that. She apologized without knowing why. After that, she paid closer attention to his reactions. She wanted to stay the version of herself he admired. Slowly, the parts of her that didn't fit began to disappear. By the time Lyra noticed she was shrinking, it felt too late to stop. Kane's moods controlled the temperature of every room. When he was quiet, she panicked. When he was warm, she relaxed. You're overthinking again, he told her often. I'm sorry, she replied automatically. She rearranged her life around his comfort. Missed calls, missed birthdays, missed herself. When she hesitated to agree with him, he sighed. I just want what's best for you, he said. She believed that love required sacrifice, that endurance was loyalty, that losing herself was proof of commitment. The warmth of his hands felt like reassurance and restraint at the same time. Lyra didn't know when love became survival. She only knew she was afraid to imagine life without him. Lyra began to notice how small decisions carried enormous weight. A misplaced word, a delayed reply. Even the tone of her laughter could shift Kane's mood. Careful, he said once, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You don't want to push me. She froze, unsure if it was a warning or a joke. I'm just saying, he added, smiling faintly. Some things need balance. Balance. She repeated the word in her head, trying to calculate what it meant for her next sentence, her next movement, her next thought. She learned to walk on invisible lines. Every interaction became a puzzle where a wrong piece could unravel her carefully constructed piece. At night, she lay awake, listening to his breathing, wondering if he was dreaming of anger or love. His presence was addictive, like oxygen she couldn't survive without, but it carried a subtle poison that crept into her bones. She stopped trusting her own instincts. Every certainty was measured against him. Every feeling was filtered through his approval. Lyra didn't recognize herself anymore, but she didn't leave. Leaving felt like a void she wasn't prepared to survive. She told herself she was helping him, healing him even, but slowly realized that she was disappearing in the process. Lyra stopped painting, stopped going to the small cafe she loved, stopped answering texts from the few friends who remained. Her laughter faded like a light bulb burning out, leaving shadows in its wake. You look tired, Kane noted one night. His voice soft but probing. I'm fine, she said quickly. No, really. Are you okay? She nodded again, a reflex. She wanted to tell him everything, but the part of her that still mattered was already learned to stay quiet. Her thoughts, once sharp and vivid, were now cautious, wrapped in fear. Lyra's existence had narrowed into an orbit around Kane. Even when she saw herself in the mirror, she struggled to remember the person who had once been there. It felt like she was peering at a stranger she had no right to recognize. Arguments weren't loud. They were whispers, shadows, gaps in conversation that left her wondering if she had done something wrong. Kane's displeasure was subtle but undeniable. A lingering glance, a pause in his smile, a half-uttered word could make her spiral. Did I do something wrong? She asked once, her voice trembling. You always do, he replied casually, brushing it off as humor. She laughed nervously, though it cut through her like ice. Every interaction became a labyrinth. She hunted for mistakes in her own behavior, rewriting conversations in her mind endlessly. Each time she found a flaw, she apologized silently, reshaped her actions, retracted desires she once thought essential. Love had become a game she couldn't win. Survival meant perfection, and perfection meant becoming smaller, quieter, less herself. Lyra had become an expert at erasure. She no longer initiated plans, no longer spoke first, no longer laughed freely. Saying no was impossible. Asking for space was inconceivable. The person she had been, the one who dreamed, fought, and loved without fear, was gone, buried under layers of careful obedience. One night, she tried to meet a friend for coffee. Kane's tone cut through her resolve. "Where are you going?" "Just for a minute," she said softly. "Are you sure they're not taking advantage of you?" She hesitated, anxiety twisting her stomach. Maybe I shouldn't." The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but she obeyed. Freedom had become dangerous. Every choice, every impulse, every emotion had to pass through Kane first. Lyra was shrinking, not in size, but in existence. She wasn't a person anymore. She was a reflection of someone else's expectations. He never hit her, never shouted with rage. But his control was precise, invisible, and unyielding. Gaslighting, guilt, and silence were his tools. Lyra walked on eggshells, each step calculated to avoid unseen triggers. "I think you're imagining things again," he said gently one evening when she tried to express frustration. She nodded, swallowing her anger, believing him. It was easier to bend than to fight. Every apology became automatic, every smile carefully measured. She had learned to anticipate his moods, to preempt disapproval, to survive in the shadow of his presence. Leaving was inconceivable, not because she loved him less, but because she feared the weight of her own absence without him. Every heartbeat, every breath was tied to his approval. Lyra's identity had melted into his, leaving only a hollow form, obedient and fragile. The mirror became a silent judge. Lyra stared at her reflection and saw only hollows where her eyes once sparkled. Her shoulders stiffened, her lips pressed tight, and she wondered who had taken her place. "Who are you anymore?" she whispered to herself one morning, voice trembling. No answer came. Only the echo of someone she didn't recognize. She tried to remember her laughter, her hobbies, her small rebellions, the things that used to define her. They felt foreign, as if she were reading about another person entirely. Kane's presence had consumed every corner of her mind. Every glance in his direction reminded her she belonged not to herself, but to the moods, the whispers, the judgments he cast like shadows over her existence. Even when Kane was gentle, fear lingered. His hands on her shoulders, his soft whispers, the closeness that once comforted her. It now carried the weight of a threat she could not name. Relief and dread tangled together, making it hard to breathe. "Stay here tonight," he said one evening, drawing her close. I should go home," she murmured. "You'll be safer with me," he insisted. His voice calm but commanding. She wanted to say no, but the words refused her. Her body obeyed before her mind could argue. Every touch reminded her how far she had fallen, how deeply she had given herself to someone else's control. Lyra began to measure every heartbeat, every emotion, and every whisper, wondering if any part of her was still hers to claim. Isolation wrapped its fingers around her tightly. Friends became distant, conversations faded, and her world narrowed to Kane's apartment, his moods, his expectations. When someone called, she hesitated, anxious about what he would think. "You've been quiet," he said once when her phone buzzed. "I was just talking," she said softly. "Be careful who you talk to," he warned lightly. She didn't argue. Freedom had become terrifying. Independence dangerous. Every desire outside of him was suspect. Lyra existed solely to maintain his comfort, his stability, his whims. The person she once was, the girl who laughed freely, who dreamed, who felt without restriction, was now a silent observer, trapped in the shadows of her own mind. Then came the words that shattered her completely. She confronted Kane one night about his cold silences and the weight of his judgment. "You're ignoring me," she said, voice barely audible. "You're imagining things," he replied smoothly, smiling like it was a joke. "You know I love you." She wanted to argue. She wanted to scream that something was wrong. But she believed him. He had taught her to trust only him, to doubt everything else. Her reality had become his story. Lyra felt the edges of herself fray further. Each attempt to assert her own experience only reinforced the truth Cain had built around her, that she could not trust her own mind. Lyra tried reclaiming herself through writing, scribbling in journals she hoped would remind her of who she once was. But the words felt alien, almost mocking. Her own handwriting seemed like a stranger's. "This isn't me," she whispered one morning, staring at a page. And yet she couldn't stop. Writing was both a rebellion and a confession, a fragile echo of her identity struggling to surface. Every sentence felt like a performance, a test to prove she still existed beyond Cain's control. But even these private acts were tainted by fear. She hesitated, rewrote lines, erased phrases, self-censoring before the words could breathe. The city outside blurred past, indifferent. Lyra moved through life on autopilot, hollowed out, obedient, tethered to a man who had stolen her sense of self without raising a hand. Lyra moved through life like a ghost, barely touching anything or anyone outside of Cain's orbit. The city became a blur, the streets and people passing unnoticed. She smiled only when necessary, laughed only when permitted, and every thought was filtered through his moods. Freedom had become terrifying. Obedience felt like safety. "You don't want trouble, do you?" Cain asked one evening as she hesitated over a minor decision. "No," she whispered. "Good," he said, as if the answer alone kept the world from collapsing. Her heart sank, realizing that even small choices, what to eat, where to go, how to respond, were no longer hers. Cain had become the center of her universe, not through charm but through erasure. She had given him not only her love, but her autonomy, her instincts, and even her memory of self. Every day became a careful calculation. Lyra measured her desires against his reactions, adjusting, apologizing, and retracting before he noticed. "You're quiet today," Cain said one afternoon, tilting his head. "Just thinking," she answered softly. "Be careful with your thoughts," he warned, smiling faintly. She obeyed. The irony was cruel. She loved him so fully that the will to fight, to assert herself, had vanished. Every need she had, every fleeting desire, was weighed against his comfort. She no longer knew what she wanted. She only knew what he approved. Her identity had been traded for his attention. Her freedom exchanged for the illusion of love. The climax came quietly, in a morning that felt ordinary until she caught her reflection. Lyra stared at the hollow eyes and trembling lips that looked back at her, wondering where the woman she had been had gone. "I can't find you," she whispered, voice shaking. There was no answer. No trace of the girl who had once dreamed, laughed, and loved freely. Only obedience remained. Survival had cost her everything. She realized then that she had not been living for years. She had been surviving. And in that survival, she had lost herself entirely. Even memories of love became tainted. Every tender touch, every whispered "I love you," carried the weight of invisible chains. She tried to recall warmth without fear, but the sensation was forever entwined with control. Love had become a ghost that haunted her chest, a parasite burrowing into her bones. "I only want to help you," Cain said once, tracing a line down her arm. And yet, the memory of his hands felt both comforting and threatening. She could not separate care from control, desire from obedience. Lyra began to understand the paradox of her life. The very person she loved had become the instrument of her erasure. She imagined leaving, fading into the shadows of a life she had almost forgotten, vanishing without explanation. But terror rooted her in place. She feared the silence of her own mind, the confrontation with the girl she had been, and the person she might become if left to herself. "Where would you go?" Cain asked softly one night. "Anywhere," she said, almost whispering. "Not without me," he said, his hand firm on her wrist. She stayed. The thought of reclaiming herself felt alien, impossible. The stranger in the mirror was all that remained of Lyra's former self, and even she seemed locked behind walls she could no longer scale. She was trapped, both physically and psychologically, in the world Cain had created, a world where love was survival and survival was erasure. Even tenderness became terrifying. A smile, a gentle touch, a whispered word of comfort. All of it felt like a trap. The warmth she had once craved now reminded her of every step she had lost, every piece of herself that Cain had carefully erased. "You're trembling," he said one night, his voice soft but knowing. I'm fine," she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as him. She realized then that the love that had once been her lifeline was now a weight pressing down on her chest. Every embrace, every affectionate glance carried chains she hadn't noticed until she tried to move. The things that once made her feel alive now reminded her how empty she had become. She tried to speak, to demand acknowledgement of her pain, but her voice faltered. Cain's hand on her cheek was gentle, almost tender. "You're imagining things," he whispered. She believed him as she always had. Her reality had been rewritten, edited, and censored until she no longer trusted her own mind. The weight of loving him had taught her to doubt everything. Her thoughts, her feelings, even the memory of who she was. Every assertion of self became suspect, every flicker of independence dangerous. Lyra had become invisible to herself, and Cain had made sure she stayed that way. Sometimes in the quiet, she imagined walking away, leaving silently, vanishing into nothing. But even in these dreams, she was haunted by shadows, chains, and the ghost of the girl she had once been. She could not abandon that girl, nor could she find her anywhere. Lyra's sense of self was now a fragmented echo, a whisper in a void, and she felt incapable of claiming even that small trace. Every memory of their early days, once tender and intoxicating, was poisoned. Each late-night conversation, each shared secret, each moment of intimacy carried the weight of his control, the shadow of her erasure. She remembered thinking she had found rescue, only to discover she had been trapped. The person she had loved, the person who had seemed so gentle, so understanding, had also been the person who slowly dismantled her from the inside. Lyra sat alone in the apartment that had become both sanctuary and prison. She traced the outlines of her hollowed hands and whispered the name of the self she had lost. The girl who had laughed freely, dreamed without fear, and loved openly was gone. She had loved Cain so fully that she no longer existed in any meaningful way. The love she thought would save her had become the instrument of her disappearance, leaving her only echoes, shadows, and a profound emptiness. At last, she understood the unbearable truth. She had loved him until she forgot who she was. Her heart, her mind, her life, all had been given to him, and in return she had received only absence. The mirror showed a hollow reflection, obedient and trembling, a woman unrecognizable to herself. Lyra whispered one final time, not to him, but to the ghost of the self she had once been. "I am still here, but only in echoes." And with that, the last fragments of hope dissolved. The love that had once felt like air now felt like chains, and the girl who had lived inside her was gone forever.